All right, well, the one that you've all been waiting for. Let's give a massive round of applause to Vitalik.
Wait, do I have a mic or not? Or
You're...
maybe bring me one for convenience. Oh, it works? Okay, perfect. Yeah. Okay.
Wait a second.
Okay, no. Oh, right. This thing. Yeah, no, that's good. Okay.
This is great. Now the playing field is more leveled from my side.
Yes. Yeah.
So we want to talk about stuff around DAOs, and I think this is how far we got in planning this. So
yeah, so Kartik, I guess maybe to start off, what are you have this very unique and privileged position of being right at the head of this lovely group that continues to attract amazing developers, amazing speakers, builders from all parts of the Ethereum world. So I'm curious, both positive and negative, what kinds of things have you seen from the world of existing DAOs and people trying to build DAOs in the last couple of years?
I'll split this into two sides. One is when we as an organization are working with DAOs to get them involved at the events, and then what we see from the hackers. And then there's like a separate perspective on, actually, you know what, and each of those have also two threads. So when we're working with organizations, the part that we've seen that's been a very consistent theme is that it's unanimously extremely hard to work with DAOs if you are an organization. And those are challenges around not knowing who the directly responsible DRI is for a given task or a given outcome. To if they want to get involved, we need to figure out how do we accept money from them and do normal compliance, which requires us to follow the laws from our end and make sure that there's a legal sign, they have the authority, they have a legal entity or something. The common blockers you run into when you work with a company as a company, work with the DAO as a company. On the hacker side, it's more interesting because we just stopped seeing experimentation about 2 years ago. I remember specifically a massive surge from 2019 to 2021. And we saw way too many cool experiments, and largely it coincided with a lot of the DeFi revolution, because people just saw the more DAOs came to be and they started popping up, and we saw small tweaks and variations. And that also even led us to do a whole hackathon just focused on DAOs to see what people can come up with or push the limits. But beyond that, they just fell flat. So I have not seen enough hacks that would let me say that there's a substantial attempt to play with DAOs anymore. I have not tried to answer why or figure out why. But my reasons... my guess would be that it's just not as exciting, and in the context of a hackathon where you have a time constraint, it's probably a negative thing for you to build something that requires coordination to show the first example and the value of it, and faking that does not make a good demo because you don't get to land the point.
So actually, just revisiting a bit the thing that you started with, right? Challenges of working with DAOs as an organization. I wonder if, the part, maybe not the parts that have to do with compliance, because that feels like
understandable.
Exactly, it's an equal problem no matter the type of DAO you have. But the problems that have to do with it not being an easy thing to negotiate with, is there any more detail that you can share? Obviously, okay, not to name names.
We'll see. So there's a couple of things. One is that oftentimes you have, I'm getting do not share names from some people on our team, which I think is a smart idea. The part that we've seen as a very common thread is that there's only a single interface to interacting with a DAO, which means most of them will say either fill out this form if you're in one of these specific tracks, but it's a grant or request to be an event sponsor, or go to our forum, and then here is a couple of posts from the past. We've seen others do it, use that as a reference. and kind of figure out what you need to communicate, and then we'll let anybody kind of comment and drive the conversation. The problem with that is, it is, in my opinion, a antagonistic default that you kind of end up proposing, which is you get treated like you have to defend from the get-go, which in some cases is fine, but in a lot of cases, like it should be discovery, and it should be around understanding if this is something that's interesting before you move on to the stage where you have to convince one or the other party. But the second you have these public discussions as a default, and anybody is allowed to comment on it, it kind of puts you as a defense, and you have no idea what you should be defending against without also knowing, does the thing I'm trying to convey to the other side, will it even reach the right person that should actually be reading this? So you end up with all these side quests of fighting people for things, or just debating like just minutia, like just doesn't irrelevant stuff before you even get to the right conclusion. And that ends up just kind of equating to time wasted without any outcome.
Okay, no, that may actually make sense. That I have one story that I remember from a couple of years ago. So remember back in 2021 when the dog coins were a big thing, right? And then remember when the Gitcoin DAO got like 40% of the Akita tokens, and then the Gitcoin DAO was like basically immediately thrown into this negotiation process, effectively, like between them and some people from the Akita community who, and the like basically the fact that like they were a DAO, like it ended up putting them at a really big disadvantage, right? Because a DAO in an adversarial negotiation process, like basically if the internal wires of your brain are open source, then like effectively
you know how to play the game. Yeah.
Exactly. The other side knows exactly how to give you, like how to create the offer that leaves you with like epsilon surplus and leaves them with like 100%, right? So it's so I think in general, like this lines up with a lot of the things that I've heard, right? And things that I've seen, right? Which is basically that like one, DAOs are kind of at a standstill, and two is like there's a couple of like very specific reasons why. And the way that I would give the diagnosis is basically that it feels to me like from like the DAO space kind of settled in this equilibrium where like essentially nobody gets fired for forking Compound. And the problem, like basically once you have an established path, then like that's when imagination stops, that's when progress stops. And the problem with a DAO is that if you have like a low competence form of governance, then like you can't really tell or like you can't even form consensus around that fact until like it's basically almost too late.
Agreed. And I think the part that I feel like I find slightly annoying is that it's not even that nobody got fired for forking Compound as a good argument, because you don't know if that is the maximum, whether it's local or global. And we just kind of settled on, hey, just because this was working and it wasn't broken enough, it's easy to repeat it. That should not have been in the norm.
Yeah, I mean, one reason why it was, I think, is like that we don't want to, or it's important not to underrate is sort of the DAOs as compliance aspect, right? Like we basically had this like very weird legal regime where, like, number one, making an honest investment is illegal, but making a thing that you explicitly say in the terms of service, this is a joke meme coin, is legal. And so basically people, like even well-meaning people ended up like repackaging what they wanted to be honest investments into joke meme coins. And so effectively Gary Gensler like massively decreased a whole bunch of people's investor protections. And number two, we had like, whenever something is used for compliance, like that itself creates conformity pressures, right? Because the point of compliance is, you're a cover your A, And when you're covering,
it sets the floor. Yes.
indeed. And when you cover the easiest way to cover your A is to basically point to some other source of legitimacy and copy them, right? Because if you're doing something new, then effectively if the IF run comes, the IF run will actually end up being on you, as opposed to if you copy someone else, it's like, hey, you copied them, they copied them. And,
you get penalized for going out of your way to do something and making it better instead of copying the standard.
Right, and the thing that feels like it's happening now is now that the need to do decentralization for regulatory reasons is reduced by a lot. I am noticing that there's a lot of projects that are just giving up on operational decentralization.
What is operational decentralization?
In the sense of basically DAOs controlling aspects of protocol development funding, other things, as opposed to just the foundation doing it.
No, I agree, and I think it tracks really well on the private kind of venture side too, which is we're seeing more and more people actually incorporate companies and set up foundations company in the U.S., which is a pretty big move because you are choosing to in a way, go back to a decision that you thought you would never make in the last 10 years.
Yeah, okay, so this is why, why DAOs suck. So the next thing I want to talk about is why DAOs are necessary.
I'd love to do that, but just want to understand one kind of point from the past, the last few minutes. I feel like everything we talked about ended up being about process and nothing about the value or the nature. Are we in agreement on that, or do you think there's some nuance there?
What do you mean by value and nature?
Sorry, as in everything we talked about as a pitfall is purely on the fact that if you were to replace a DAO with a poorly run company or a group project or a Telegram group chat, none of the answers change. They're fully detached from being a DAO in any form.
Right. So I think we want to decouple organizational structure from I guess kind of legal form, right? And or maybe I'm not sure if legal form is the right word, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying everything that we talked about is a human process flaw, not anything related to a DAO or being on chain specifically.
Right. Okay. Maybe to kind of triangulate a bit, right? You want to find sort of the opposite. Quadrants of the square. Imagine hypothetically someone made an on-chain DAO, and the way that DAO worked was much more conventional. Imagine, for example, every 6 months, the token holders elect a CEO, and then that CEO has the rights to just approve everything unilaterally, say up to some dollar limit. What would you predict your experience negotiating a sponsorship with that would look like?
At least faster than usual, just because it by default assumes a hierarchical flow of how anywhere from people to initiatives and parties are organized. So you at least get an answer back faster because there's a clear incentive and a goal that this entity has, and there's just much harder or much stronger accountability, which I think is the key factor here.
Right. And then on the flip side, imagine you were negotiating with a regular company, an LLC or GmbH or whatever, but that company just happens to have rules that required board approval for literally everything, and the board had 73 members. How would your experience negotiating a sponsorship with that look like?
Just the way DAOs are right now.
Okay. Yeah. So
I think. Yeah. But they can still move. Yeah. Actually, if it's contingent on board approval with that size, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think a lot of the challenges do have to do with the actual structure, right? More about sort of how the wires are made rather than whether or how the wires are organized rather than whether the metal the wires are designed to are created out of is sort of Ethereum smart contract metal or legal enforcement metal.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it's also an important thing. So okay, so maybe why DAOs are necessary, right? So what are the biggest users of DAOs right now?
DeFi projects and NFT projects.
Okay. And so the one I would have mentioned is ENS, but that is an NFT project. So
Technically, Inus is an NFT, but yeah.
Yeah, ERC 721. So okay. So I think for a DeFi project, right? For a DeFi project to work, like if it's Uniswap can like be like this actually doesn't apply. But if it's like say like something like Aave or something like a collateralized stablecoin, it relies on an oracle, right?
Yes.
The thing is only safe if the oracle is safe.
If you're what?
If the oracle is safe.
I see. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
So, like, if hypothetically, you had a big CDP for $10 million and then someone broke the oracle, your $10 million will be gone. Okay. Now, so therefore, for DeFi to work at all, the oracle has to be managed by something. Now, if the oracle was managed by like one person, then like, would it be reasonable to call the thing DeFi?
You mean the DAO, a DeFi DAO?
Yeah, like the oracle, right? Either it's managed by a person or it's managed by multisig or a DAO or something else.
That's a tough one because I think you can argue both sides. One on just the you can say yes based off of the fact that it's classified as DeFi because of the utility it's providing. And then one is on the tooling aspect of it. We need these 5 things to be true for it to be considered that. So I feel like you're taking the latter stance. In that case, no. But if there's a price oracle and it's run by one person or one computer, but it still serves the job of providing you the price, it may still count. It may not be as sturdy.
What's the thing that you would feel more comfortable putting $10 million in?
Better assurances on having anywhere from fallback to, in a way, surge protection.
Storage protection?
A surge, just like any volatility or just having some sort of backup plan for how do you actually handle inconsistencies in anywhere from data to stronger consistency on the expectation of liveliness.
Right, okay. And then for for ENS, it's like a similar thing, right? Where like basically, like protocol upgrades have to be managed somehow, and either it's managed by centralized thing or it's managed by decentralized thing, right? So like, I think one thing that's interesting for me about the difference between like these kinds of things, right? And like here are basically trying to motivate like use cases where DAOs actually make a lot of sense from some of the earlier use cases is that there's a difference between like things that have to make strategic decisions versus things that have to fulfill like basically some dumb pipe function that's like that's still subjective, right? And so like one of the arguments that I would make actually is like we should actually view those two very differently, right?
I agree.
Yeah, like if you have an oracle, then if you had a board of 73 people and there was no CEO, and each board member just by themselves had to figure out how to maintain the ETH/USD price, and then you like took a median of all of them, then like that would actually work better than any one of them. But on the other hand, like you don't want to negotiate with that.
Yes.
Okay, so. Like this is like basically like this is also what I call the like the concave versus convex regime, right? Basically where like if you think of the decision space that a thing has to make, like basically is a compromise better than a coin flip, right? And there are situations where a coin flip is better, right? Like you definitely don't want ETH Prague to be hosted like halfway in between here and Berlin. You definitely don't want it hosted halfway in between here and New York. I'm pretty sure that's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But on the other hand, like halfway in between two people's ETH/USD values is like probably more accurate than either one of them. So basically, I think one of the arguments is like there is a type of DAO whose job it is to like basically just like perform some subjective function where it's like not actually trying to be a live player.
Yes. I think the interesting part to me is that while I agree with what you're saying, I feel like you're picking an example that is way less common in our space. The majority of how DAOs work right now are purely fund managers, and they don't need any external data on at least a contract level to behave. They just need to coordinate sending money from A to B.
Agree. So like basically, yeah. So so fund allocation is also like one of those. Like I think if I had to kind of make a like very high level typology of the DAO space, I'd say like things like data Oracle like things. I mean, possibly throw in Claros type court like things in one bucket. Like data providers is one. Another one is fund allocators. And then a third would be like basically things that have to steer a ship.
What's an example of the third?
Something that I mean, like if hypothetically,
would ENS be the third one here or the first one?
I think ENS has to be the third one. Like.
So what's
okay? Maybe there's like
is there a more popular first one? Because I guess I'm looking for like what are
popular,
more
right?
used.
Well, what's interesting about popular here, right, is that the data provider use case, like we don't think about it, but it like underpins the security of like billions of friggin' dollars, right? Like
absolutely. So I guess would you say the Maker Oracle is the first one here, or is it the third one?
Maker Oracle is the first one, but the DAO, like the Maker DAO, in the sense of the thing that's deciding to rename itself to Sky and like doing all that
and
stuff.
And then go back to Maker, yes.
Right, exactly. Like there you don't want compromises, right? Imagine if like we made a compromise between Maker and Sky and the thing got renamed to My Protocol. So there's like a bunch of different spaces, right? And like I think these spaces, like in some of them you clearly need DAOs. And in other ones, like there is a stronger case that, like, for example, something like the parts of Maker that decide on, like whether or not to do a rebrand, like probably should look more like a corporation.
Okay, yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, so that's one of these kind of things, right? So then, like for me, the interesting question is, like if we want to make like kind of remake these things from scratch, right? Then, like what kinds of principles would we remake them on top of? And so we talked about like basically the existing, like compound model, right? And one of the things that struck me about what you said, it also confirms what a lot of other people have told me, is that like actually a big part of the problem comes from transparency, right? Basically a big part of the problem comes from the fact that there's this public discourse process, and if you want a sponsorship, you have to like publicly negotiate with a crowd, right? And I mean, the whole like the Gitcoin Akita situation thing was actually pretty similar, right? And like actually, a negotiation where you're like every single thing that every person says is like simultaneously also public signaling is like it creates a lot of problems.
Well, but it's yes, but I think the more concrete point there is that you are now suddenly in a conversation with people who have nothing to do with that decision and are providing input that gets treated with the same weight.
Okay, so not enough specialization, basically.
Not even specialization. It's just that like it's like, let's say, let's get dinner today, right? And like, where should we go? And everybody from the audience starts to recommend their preferences for what they think they're feeling like eating tonight. That's a weird situation because they can give input, but you feel like now you have to consider it. Or if you say, oh, I feel like eating, I don't know, Japanese food today, and somebody says loudly, oh, no, that sucks. Like, it creates a group setting that should not be a setting to begin with. And that's what negotiating in a DAO looks like.
Right. Okay. So what I guess the dinner example, right? Like one way you might plausibly improve on this is whenever it's obvious that a group is going to needs to have dinners, like let's say the subset of the ETH Global world that's coming to Prague, you make a SubDAO, and then only the SubDAO makes decisions.
And that's how people are saying. So you now have like, oh, if you want to have a request for a sponsorship or for us to be at an event, go post here. So there is specialization, but I think but the expectation most DAOs and forums set is that anybody is able to chime in and say whatever they feel like, even if they have zero involvement in the community or are even a token holder in any form.
Yeah, and so I think one of the questions that like I think is interesting to put to the world, right? And this is like part of my goal of trying to reopen the Overton window here is what if you have DAOs that don't have a social norm that just about anybody is able to contribute to anything?
So what's the definition there of a DAO? Just an execution engine of a decision transferring money or something else?
I mean, at the top level, yes. But I think the question is like, what is the underlying value that the decentralization layer is providing, right?
I guess I'm trying to think about how often are DAOs making a decision on the potential impact of a request or a decision versus a more deterministic outcome. Because I think what you said works really well in those scenarios. But if I have to say, oh, if I were to do this now, if I were to bet long term on X, I think those are less modelable.
So what kind of scenarios
Like-
are less modelable?
Let me see if I can. I'm trying to figure out what is a good way to communicate that. Somebody willing to make a bet on saying, hey, if we have the option to, okay, you asked this is a good example. So a DAO has a mandate to get more people to build on the protocol. Very, very abstract. And there's two requests that come in that says you should build, or you should, hey, we're hosting an accelerator in San Francisco. We're going to get the best engineers, and we think you giving us $100,000 will get you at least three companies, three projects trying to build companies on you, which is like just very, very random. And then you see another proposal saying, hey, we can do the exact same thing, but in some small town in some rural area in also America, and we'll try to offer you the same outcome, but for $20,000.
Right.
Mathematically, you're like, okay, well, if the outcome is three companies, maybe I should get the cheaper one. But if you are betting on a long-term tech company, maybe it's a higher odds bet that you should spend $100,000 because the odds of that company succeeding out of San Francisco might be higher. So you have some of these types of situations where you want the ability to override a decision because it comes from someone's anywhere from experience to kind of taking a bet largely, and those are not deterministic outcomes.
Right. Okay. So, like, you want to have, you want DAOs to be friendly to the idea of a person making a bet, and like sometimes that bet is going to be non-consensus.
Yes, but it's not social because we're talking about removing the social aspect of it, which is not the same as removing a human from endorsing what action should be taken.
Agree. Right, and so possibly like reducing the amount of communication, or maybe like structuring it so you don't like the default is not all to all, might actually enable like more kind of radical bets to be made.
And that's how usually most companies function.
Indeed. Okay. Now, the thing that you'd want is people making radical bets where you might that might turn out to be a success that just suddenly motivates like a bigger change in strategy, and then suddenly ETH Global is 5 times more effective. The thing you don't want is someone saying like, hey, how about we put $100,000 so that my brother can buy a Tesla, and like here I'm going to give 5 paragraphs about how he's going to put the word ETH Global on his Tesla, and that's going to be marketing for you guys.
Hypothetically speaking.
Okay. So that's right. And so that like what that implies, right, is that there is value in some kind of account.
I mean, we've seen DAOs put their logos on F1 cars, so
indeed,
it's not even a fake example.
Yeah, indeed. So you do want some kind of accountability layer. And so what's interesting there actually is that making the accountability layer decentralized might actually be fine, might actually be best.
Okay, I'm not sure I agree with that. Can you help me understand?
So let's imagine you have a person who starts a project, and let's say this project could be starting a new $100,000 accelerator, and the project could be putting the word ETH Global on his brother's Tesla and buying the Tesla. Then 6 months later, you'd want to have some process that evaluates it. And then if the evaluation turns out negative, then presumably you would want to like basically not give that person any execution authority anymore. And if it's positive, then like you might actually want to give them more authority.
How is that any different than just having that same person be valued in a shorter time scale if they were still responsible? Like, well,
what do you mean evaluation? Because like an accelerator, like it does take 6 months to figure out if the company is even material.
No, sorry, just so I understand, was your initial premise that you're saying anytime a decision is made, it's going to a new person, and then we evaluate if that person should be allowed again?
Not necessarily. I'm saying whatever mechanism you have for allocating decisions to people, it could be random, it could be one CEO, it could be whatever. Then it might be valuable to have a layer 6 months later that basically says like, was this actually a good idea?
So let's say in this case, like that accelerator is one decision this person makes,
right?
And then the next week they make 10 other decisions.
Right. So you might want to merge, and you might want to like evaluate a collection of decisions in totality. That's fine.
Okay, so I think, but sorry. So your argument is that if someone else, usually at random, is evaluating this in the future, and they determine that this was not a good decision, this person should be penalized and not allowed to make whatever.
I mean, I guess what I'm saying, like, one is like, okay, do you agree that having some kind of like evaluation mechanism can be valuable?
Yeah, absolutely. That's how companies work, yes.
Right. And then two is like that evaluation mechanism being decentralized in some form is fine.
But does that equate to a new jury determining this or something else? What does it mean to have that be decentralized?
Right. It could be a new jury. It could, I mean, like if you had to ask me for an answer, I would actually say it should be a jury that's a combination of relative insiders and relative outsiders.
Yep.
I mean, in principle, could be token holders, but I think like I would only support.
You want some bias protection.
Yeah, like well, basically, I would only support like a full outsider jury for decisions whose scope is kind of grand enough that like the entire community would be in a position to basically be insiders.
No, I mean I think that makes sense, but I still don't see why you need any new forms of setting that as a norm. You can have. Like if you're already agreeing to having a hierarchy and having somebody responsible for a decision,
right?
Presumably you would also set up a feedback loop for that person, which doesn't have to be outsiders, but it could still be part of.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, it should be people inside the community. Yes. So okay. Like basically, if you have a mechanism that is centralized, then like either that centralized person is reporting to something else that's centralized, or they're the king. And if they're the king, you need a way to throw out a mad king.
Yep.
Okay. And so basically, and so the way to throw out a mad king, like, so I would actually, so my case for making it decentralized is basically, if it's centralized, then it's just going to collude with the king and you have a capture risk.
But how do you ensure that there's no collusion when the jury is evaluating it?
Okay, so this is where I think like going to privacy by default can actually help.
So, but we're all just relying on votes. But doesn't that jury need consensus in terms of like they need to talk to each other instead of pure binary kind of decisions that they make, and the aggregate is determining someone's fate? So.
It depends, right? Because, okay, so for example, are you familiar with how the conclave works? Like the mechanism for choosing the Pope?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, you have the cardinals, right? And then the cardinals get put in a room. And then, 3 times a day they make a vote. And then and between the vote, they are allowed to talk to each other, but they're also not allowed to talk to the outside world, right? And so what's interesting to me about that is like it's imposing a communication structure other than full transparency. And it's doing that in a very in an opinionated way with the goal of like basically trying to like maximize quality and trying to minimize I mean capture risk is a big part of it, right? So like there have been a lot of like historical situations where like lots of countries, like very powerful countries would care who the Pope is. I mean, okay. So like I would argue that one of the big value propositions of decentralization is capture prevention.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe, right. And so one of the things that makes capture easier is like basic. One is a smaller number of people, and two is like much wider communication.
Sorry, is this the thing we just talked about considered much wider communication or more accountability?
Right. So in order to capture someone, you have to be able to communicate with them.
Yes. Okay, sure.
Okay. And so there's also two types of capture. One type of capture is what I would call internal capture. And internal capture would be when basically the people that are meant to be trustees of a thing become more loyal to each other than they become to the thing. External capture is when the trustees of the thing all get bribed by the French government. I know, I just have never picked on France before.
I guess we won't be seeing you at ETC this fall. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if you want to avoid external capture, then you do the conclave thing. Right?
Just not have a private jet, I guess.
Exactly. Right. Now, if you want to avoid internal capture, then like you could actually try to like put some walls inside of the conclave, right? And like you could do lots of things, right? Like you could just like basically, you could put like every cardinal in a separate cell, or you could put them in groups of 3 and let them talk to each other in groups of 3. Or you could even put them in separate cells, but let them go on the internet, but don't tell them who the other cardinals are. Yeah. Okay.
I just want to point out that I think in this example and this design, you're assuming that these people are not interacting with each other in person and they exist in different parts of the world.
Yes.
Talking exclusively online to each other.
Yes.
Is that a fair assumption? Because I don't agree so.
It's an assumption that is, I think, fair. Like, it can have degrees of fairness. Like, it can have degrees of correctness, and you can engineer for higher degrees of correctness.
Okay, sure, fair.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this is like to me this is like the point that I want to try to zoom out here, right? Is like, okay, so one is decentralization is like it seems more obviously good at something that we might call the accountability layer than at something we might call the layer of making individual decisions. Two is that trying to explicitly structure communication is better than making like everyone talk to everyone at default. And then 3 is that making these things work well is like actually a pretty friggin' interesting engineering problem.
Sorry, which part?
Figuring out these kinds of these kinds of governance structures and figuring out the combinations of them that actually get good results.
But if anything, these are to me modules to an existing DAO contract that effectively let people be revoked for their multi-sig capabilities.
Right. So, I mean, ultimately, like anything is a combination of modules, right? And so,
sorry, what I'm trying to say is like, to me, if anything, you made the case that it's easier to build this as a plugin to an existing DAO contract that is more popular than it is as a full-on brand new replacement.
What is the part of existing DAO contracts that you think is most valuable to keep?
Oh, just the fact that in a way a vote triggers a change, and ultimately at least 95 out of 100 times DAOs are facilitating a flow of funds from one destination to another, and everything else is just part of sometimes theater and sometimes actual good decision making. And what we just covered is more about, okay, we are agreeing to make a decision and it flows the way it does normally, but we're adding this future accountability process.
So if we talk about the funds use case, right, then like the most vanilla way to do it is you need a vote to approve funds being sent, right? And
right, but it doesn't mean it has to be everybody voting. You could still be that same person responsible for triggering.
Right, exactly. So what you could do is you could have like basically one person responsible for moving funds, and then you have limits and you have separate mechanisms for adjusting the limits. Right. Yeah. Okay. And so effectively, like, you still have voting modules, but the things that the voting modules are wired to can be very different. And like very plausibly, you actually want to take away the wire that connects the ability, like the voter's ability to just like do, like basically have a root key and do whatever they want.
Yep. Absolutely.
So one, I mean, I could give one example, right? So if we take a DeFi protocol, then one interesting thing about DeFi protocols is that often the TVL of the DeFi protocol is much greater than the TVL of the DeFi protocol token itself.
Usually, yes.
Yes. And I would argue that this is good and this is necessary because if you do the math in situations where that's not true, like basically to justify the DeFi protocol token being worth more than the TVL, like basically the amount of rent it extracts has to be greater than the discount rate. And that's like a pretty high amount of extraction.
Yeah.
And so but then if you have a protocol where the TVL is much higher than the value of the protocol token, then you have a problem, which is that someone could buy up 51% of the protocol token and then use that to steal the TVL.
Which has happened on multiple occasions.
Yes. And so if you don't want this to happen, then you need like basically mandatory indirection between the token holders and the thing that's controlling the Oracle price.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
But I guess maybe my pushback here is I'm not familiar with a DeFi protocol where the DAO is connected to the Oracle of the actual DeFi contracts. So
right. I mean, a lot of them they basically outsource to Chainlink, right?
Yes, but so what you said is I don't think it's a real example. Is my what I'm kind of pointing out.
Right, like, what's the example you're most familiar with?
No, I guess what I'm saying is like almost all DeFi protocols are not tied at all to their DAOs.
Right.
So even if I had a supermajority vote on a decision on what the DAO can dictate, I do not have any path to touch the TVL of the DeFi protocol.
Is there a DAO that you're familiar with whose Oracle is not just pointing to Chainlink?
Well, technically, Uniswap's using its own TWAP data. Yeah.
Right, but Uniswap isn't like one of.
It's a good question. I don't think I know off the top of my head.
Right. Okay. And then there's the question of like the internal workings of something like Chainlink itself, right? Okay, but that's but again, that's like like one type of use case, right? And like the use case that's like very like operative and top of minds to people is basically the funds allocation use case. Okay, so for the funds allocation use case, I guess like what are some properties that you think would be valuable for a funds allocation mechanism to have that you think are generally not being met well right now?
I don't think that's a big list at all, because if anything, those things are the final execution of a decision that's made. So everything usually is how do you get to that decision. I do see a lot of, actually, that's an interesting one. I do have an answer there, but it kind of comes back to the compliance world over operational, which is oftentimes if you're giving out a grant to somebody or for whatever initiative money is being given out, it's almost impossible to have that person receive the payments in a different chain or in a stablecoin, because the DAOs are incentivized by definition to use their own token. But it gets counted against somehow towards their own success if any money going out for any initiative ends up being sold immediately for a stable coin to help increase the value of that protocol.
Yeah, no, I know. The Ethereum Foundation gets this all the time. Remember, 3 commandments of the Ethereum Foundation, right?
Which, you guys are a DAO?
Well, one is, we're...
a DAO can get a Kraken account?
No. Yeah, no, it's like 1, we're not allowed to sell our ETH, and 2, we're expected to pay researchers and devs and pay them even more. And
it's like the DAO has to now take on the financial. I guess both sides have to take on the financial risk of the market price affecting you in mostly a negative case.
Yeah, and so this is like also what this could possibly be one of those areas again where like privacy actually is the solution. Because like, okay, imagine if you had a lunar punk DAO that just basically automatically like gave its grants through a privacy protocol, and then the recipient like they would not even know if it was if they were just like immediately swapping it out through like some swap inside of Relay.
No, it's a good way intermediary, or you can request a destination to be a contract that automatically swaps any incoming amount to a stablecoin.
Yeah.
But then you get into politics over tech.
Then people can
yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess maybe my kind of question back to you is, well, do you have a more concrete way to rethink how DAOs are managed right now? Or are we kind of breaking this by parts and you're coming to the conclusion that all these three cases should be treated differently and we should not really try to blend one solution for all three?
Yeah, so I think, okay, so maybe my conclusions so far would be like one, reopen the Overton window, right? In the sense that, like, I don't think the starting point should be like start with a coin vote, figure out where the coin vote fails, and then make a delta. The starting point should be identify the problem and engineer around the problem. So that's point one. Point two is that privacy matters. And we have ZK, we have encryption, we have forms of communication that are not public forums. And we even have ZK voting frameworks that are getting better and better. And so ZK should be much more of a default. Like we should view not just flow of funds, but also flow of information as something that can be engineered around trying to make particular outcomes. And so that's probably point two, right? And I think another thing that's like really also fundamental, right, is this problem of like allocation of attention. Like I think we haven't really talked about this, right? This is the problem where like, from the perspective of voter. Actually, have you voted in DAOs much?
Yeah, I've done a couple.
I guess out of the times that you're theoretically supposed to vote, how many times have you voted?
Maybe 20% of the time.
20 is high. Have you delegated?
Yes, yeah. Then after that, it's...
After they delegate.
I'm more in favor of a republic model.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I think... like to me, the attention issue is like one of those fundamental things, right? And another way that I think about this is that what we're basically trying to figure out is like we're basically one part is preference aggregation and another part is execution, right? And for like often asking people to answer specific decisions is like not actually the best way to like get their information on preferences, right? And like separating out preference aggregation from decision making more, like I think is good, right? And like and also you can view accountability as actually being a type of preference aggregation, right?
Yeah.
It's retroactive, but the accountability is with respect to something, right? And so it's with respect to some kind of preferences, right?
Yeah, or at least you're maximizing a goal that's agreed upon ahead of time.
Exactly. So one other conclusion I've had is that I think AI is going to be actually be pretty important for DAOs. So actually, on the topic of AI, what kinds of AI crypto projects have you seen so far?
Right now, I have seen a lot of ways to talk to ChatGPT to understand how much crypto I have in my wallet. But we're making progress every month. There have been a lot of creative ways to have the bots actually aggregate information, or sorry, LLMs aggregate information. And I think kind of the benefit here that I feel like is beyond just requesting information is actually being able to create payloads and parse different information. So I've seen really interesting examples from one of our last hackathon, which was for just it was called Trifecta, with just like the past ETH Global winners were only allowed to compete. And a cool example there was somebody actually just saying, I need X token and I have all these things in my wallet, figure out how do I get the best route and do anywhere from swaps to intent orders and just get me the outcome. And there the bot kind of, or just the LLM just knew, hey, these are 5 strategies I can try and I can aggregate information and make sense of it and then make the best decision. So you can delegate some of those types of cases. We have not seen much beyond that. There have been a couple projects in the past that like do try to summarize DAO proposals from forums to kind of more decision based kind of summaries, but that doesn't help you bet on the quality of a decision. It just helps you maybe save less time reading it. So I don't have a super optimistic opinion on that just yet.
Right. Okay. So one interesting thing there, right, is that it's actually a good example of this like theme of separating preference expression from execution, right? Because preference expression is basically saying, like, hey, I want 100, like USDC, or like I want 0.1 ETH, right? And then execution is, well, out of all these friggin' protocols, how do I get it?
Yes.
And preferences are a complicated thing, right? So, like, for example, let's say you have 100, you want is 0.1 ETH, but then it turns out that at this particular time, the Ethereum chain is going wonky for some reason, and literally every means of getting 100 or 0.1 ETH would actually involve like losing 40% to slippage. What in that world, what would you want the AI to do?
Abort.
Abort. Okay. Now, but in your original request, you did not say abort, did you?
Yes, because you're assuming that
you're assuming the thing
you would make the decision like you would as a human, and only when you realize you've lost 40%, you were like, oh, I should have actually communicated that.
Right. The thing that common law calls the reasonable person test, but it's like actually much more subtle than that, right? Because like I think you don't just want it to optimize for a reasonable person, like you really want it to optimize for you. Yeah. Like, okay, maybe hypothetical example, right? Let's say you are in an airport and you need a plane ticket to go to an ETH Global that you literally learned about 1 hour ago, and you need to be there tomorrow. And this is a high priority need. And all your credit cards failed. And you're buying a plane ticket using crypto. And the plane ticket only accepts, like, say, USDC. You have ETH, and you want the plane ticket. Now, in that particular case, if the only way to get it is paying 40% slippage, would you want it to?
Sometimes outcome, okay. Because you would make a decision based off of getting to that outcome. And
But let's say you were not Kartik, and you were instead someone who like kind of wanted to go to that event, but you don't really care that much.
They may just be like, oh, but this is...
Then you may just say no, right? And so this is like the individual case, right? And so like things that exist in the individual case, like they generally have analogs in the organization case, right? And so I think, like to me, like basically this kind of preference expression is like actually one of the most potentially valuable crypto AI use cases. And actually, it gets interesting when you start like thinking about preference expression in other domains. So, okay, maybe one example. How many days have you been in Europe?
5.
How many GDPR click-throughs have you collected in those 5 days?
5 a day.
How annoyed are you?
10 out of 10 on that scale.
Okay. So, well, like the thing that you're trying, this whole like mess is theoretically trying to do, right, is basically, like express your preferences in terms of what kind of data you're willing to give up, right? How much meaningful data about your values in terms of your trade-off between data and convenience do you think you've actually communicated to these websites?
Near zero.
Okay. So basically, now imagine if like instead AI was actually involved in that, right? And effectively, instead of a very impatient version of yourself doing these negotiations, like you actually had an LLM participating, right? Would you want that?
Possibly, yeah. Because if it's doing in the background and I have to be involved, yes.
Right. Okay. So in like one of my guesses also is that in a lot of cases, this is the type of AI DAO that actually makes sense, which is basically a lot of the time you want execution to just be done by AI. Now,
why is it an AI DAO? Like, what's the DAO part of it? Just the fact that it...
Well, the DAO part of it in this case would have to be the accountability layer, right? Like say, yeah, you have like $5 million. Like you don't want like literal chat GPT to be able to send $5 million wherever you want.
Understood. Got it. I thought you meant the AI DAO's job is to do these negotiations in
Yeah.
this case on your behalf.
Right. So the AI DAO might do some negotiations, right? But you generally, like you want to have limits, and you also want to have some accountability layer. And for the like you want to design some kind of accountability layer so that like basically instead of like making a DAO king, like you basically you want to be able to remove the DAO, the mad king, or at least you want to be able to figure out like which combination of models actually does a good job of satisfying your preferences without like enshrining a single one. Right. Okay. So like this to me is also the like this is also for me actually the motivation behind the deep funding thing. This is and like now there's stuff happening on deep gov, right? Basically, we want AI, but we want AI to be the tool. We don't want AI to be a king.
Yeah, and I guess the part that I'm happy about in this thing is that we're finally talking about the A in the DAO.
Autonomous, yeah. I mean, remember the original posts from back in 2013 that I wrote?
Yes.
Yeah. So
actually, maybe as a it'll be helpful to now kind of have you talk about the motivation of the DAO from 20. I guess just walk us through the motivation of the DAO, and then
okay. So the DAO, yeah. So the DAO was basically meant to be a like distributed autonomous investment fund, right? A bunch of people pooled their ETH together, and then there were like basically people would collectively and like democratically decide on what kinds of things to invest in, and like basically this would be a vehicle for like people funding projects together.
So if we were to apply the suggestions we just talked about and retry that experiment, how do you think that'll go?
I think it depends entirely on the details. Like maybe we should, right? I think like okay, imagine if we did the DAO 2.0, but like number one, like voting is private. Number two, you don't just do everything in one layer, you have SubDAOs. And then number three, the SubDAOs themselves are going to be heterogeneous. Some of them will get run by CEOs. Some of them will get run by like pointers to GPT with a few prompts. Some of them will get run by like DeepSeek running on like some combination of infra with like a particular fine tune, right? And some of it might even involve voting in specified groups. And then, like you could imagine, probably a lot more like layer separation between making decisions and if like some kind of accountability or preference expression. Then, like I could imagine a lot of really cool things happening.
Yeah, the reason I brought that up is because that is actually a perfect example where the highest payoff comes usually from a non-consensus decision, and that kind of counters every other DAO behavior we see now or what we discuss. Because if you're investing in something, you kind of have to bet on a few years down the road versus 6 months. So even if somebody thinks, oh, this company did nothing and it's been 6 months, what are you doing? You made a bad decision, you're fired. That's probably not how a real life investment would work.
Yeah. So one thing that's interesting is that like I see a bit of a parallel actually to the crypto space. So remember, so the original posts I wrote on DAOs, they were kind of inspired by Daniel Suarez's book Diamond. And if you think about what Diamond is, like in those books, it's actually an OW. It's an autonomous organization that isn't actually that decentralized. Okay, so the analogy is if you think about the things that Bitcoin is a historical heir to, right? So you have Bitcoin, and then what came before Bitcoin?
eCash?
eCash, right? Chaumian and eCash, right? So Chaumian and eCash, it was actually not decentralized at all. It was a server, but it was private.
It was private, yeah.
And it protected your privacy even from the server. So we basically went from something that was centralized, but it satisfied a kind of cypherpunk usefulness property, to something that was decentralized, but that lost that property. And then eventually we figured out ZK snarks, and now we have both. So with DAOs, we basically went from this this hypothetical AI thing that was not decentralized and it was autonomous. Then we went to things that were decentralized that were basically not autonomous at all. And now I'm suggesting, well, what if we actually have both?
And I think you want both because
you want both.
you want operational complexity to be reduced, but you also want the ability to have more human input in some scenarios that require non-consensus decisions, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So non-consensus decisions. Would you be more excited about DAOs if they were more able to make non-consensus decisions?
I don't think it's one thing, right?
Okay.
Like, yes, because
Hmm.
a lot of, so I say that from the context of, I think it's fair to say that most DAOs here exist to help the underlying protocol be successful long term. And that means you have to make decisions that have a much higher payoff for you to be more successful over a period of time. And sometimes decisions end up being investments that may pay off later in the future. And you kind of see that it's not a DAO, but like we kind of saw this as a massive initiative with all the ZK world benefit from for the last kind of 8 years. So those are things where like, oh, why are you wasting $100 million funding ZK research instead of like making the L1 better or something, without realizing that if you make that investment and it does pay off, then you end up redeeming yourself or changing the trajectory in a much more meaningful way. And that's kind of what I mean by non-consensus, because some people may say, well, this seems like a waste of money, no matter what the decision is. And chances are majority of the people will say that, because not everybody kind of looks about making decisions for day to day or thinking that far ahead. And you want the ability to not be criticized for a decision that you know will take longer than expected for a future payoff.
Okay. If you were in charge of like one of the treasuries of a DeFi protocol, then like what would you do?
Abstractly, I would spend as much money as possible trying to integrate with as many things as possible. And and kind of the reasoning for that is it's in your best interest to treat that as a funnel. And most of DeFi does behave like zero sum in terms of there's a winner take all effect. And it's in your best interest to get as much reach as possible and then double down later on what's working. So be very less picky about integration initiatives and maximize distribution.
Would you like basically spend like most of the treasury very quickly, or is sustainability more important? Could be both.
I mean, it has to be important because you, again, like this is the long-term bet, right? Like if you're saying I'm gonna, let's say I've seen some DAOs invest money in companies as an actual startups. There, you have to kind of make sure that you're at least thinking 3 years ahead, if not slightly longer. In that world, yes, but you're also at the same time taking the bet that like, well, maybe if I overspend now and it does help me increase the success of a protocol and potentially the value of my token, I may extend the runway. And I would argue that this is exactly what the EF has done. And that also is a fair decision. You can actually outspend more than you are able to afford. And if you think these will work out well, then you end up extending the runway.
What about like the meta level, like in terms of decision-making authority? Would you want to keep the decision-making authority yourself? Would you want to like give it to some other structure, some of both?
Mix of both, but you would still appoint somebody who is accountable to at least track and observe and understand how things are going. So you have in a way a reporting structure to get an answer at any given time, what the progress of your work is.
And like, what would you want that reporting structure to be accountable to?
What or whom?
What both?
Well, whom is in a way, I guess if it's I guess I am assuming there's probably a normal company behind the DAO,
right?
So that, but also fundamentally to the community, there could be an open report, but the what would be largely just in a way a summary and an activity report of like, hey, we did this and this is where things are going. So there's also public accountability for who the recipients are.
So one type, and maybe one an example from back in the day, right? So do you remember 10x?
Yes.
Yeah, again, remember like back in 2017, I mean, I think they were one of the examples, but there were a lot of examples. There were projects that raised a huge amount of money, and then they tried a thing, and then at some point, they were like feeling a bit down, and then they effectively pivoted to giving their founding team like essentially a retirement, right? So how would you prevent yourself from doing that?
Specific question being, how would I prevent a DAO from executing an action that just gives money to?
Or how would you prevent a project's leadership from basically just like essentially continuing to feed itself for a very long time?
I see. Yeah. So in my example of kind of saying, let's try everything and make it a funnel, you are setting a cap for this is what the initial kind of initiative looks like. And I would only consider deploying more capital to that thing once there's some proof point that it's working, because then you have data points instead of bets without data to see, hey, this was a cool thing. They got it done in 2 weeks, whereas everybody else took a month. And suddenly there's a surge of users from their end, and this is going well. Let's see if we can continue this. So you actually have empirical information.
So you as an individual would basically empower groups of people, but then you'd put like milestones behind.
Yes.
If hypothetically, you learned that in 2 weeks, you would have to permanently retire, and let's say you get teleported to a foreign galaxy, what structure would you replace yourself with?
You would try to find the next closest person who believes the same thing that you do, and put them in charge.
Okay, so you'd favor a single person.
Or it seems like the premise is that I am that single person in this example, so I would say find the best replacement you have.
Right.
But if you're saying the whole thing is a one-person thing,
well, no, I'm saying you have a DeFi project, and like while you as a founder are running the thing, then let's say you're very hands-on, but then at some point you have to teleport to a foreign galaxy. Then you could replace yourself with a person. You could also replace yourself with a group.
I would prefer the person over a group.
Okay. I think I would go in the opposite direction.
I know, because there's 2 co-directors.
Indeed. Indeed there is. Cool. Maybe, okay, so just, oh wow, it's...
yeah, we should
already 6:05, wrap this up. But, I don't know, maybe, so, I guess, what are some... So final takeaways from maybe from my side first, right? Is again that I think this whole space of governance mechanisms, whether we're talking about allocating funds, is a space, or whether we're talking about maintaining an oracle, or whether we're talking about like wackier stuff like running a city, like basically burn down the legitimacy of the existing paradigms, reopen the Overton window, like be more willing to think about things from scratch. Think about privacy as a first-class ingredient. I'd also say think about AI as a first-class ingredient. I'd also say like multi-level structures are good. And so, like, I'm much less of a direct democracy fan than I was 15 years ago. I mean, I think.
Thank God.
Okay. I mean, God himself is not a democracy, right?
Thank gods.
Yeah. Okay, so what is the word God backwards?
Doge, I think.
Exactly. So you added an E at the end, which is good. Are you familiar with the selection algorithm for the original Doge? I don't mean Cabo-chan.
No.
So there's, I'm familiar with the Doge of Venice.
No.
So Doge is the Italian word for Duke, just like fun coincidence.
Did not realize that.
Venice is, a city in Italy. And for about 5 centuries, like basically from the 13th century all the way up until Napoleon, it had this really interesting mechanism for selecting the Duke, which was basically you had 1,200 nobles, and then those nobles, they elected some small number, like I think it was like 30 or something like that. And then out of that 30, you randomly selected 10. And then those 10 elected another, like some other number, like 45, and then you randomly selected some, and then you've elected again, you selected some, and then finally you elected a group that chose the Doge. And this is like very multi-level, right?
Yeah, this is like a bisection going on for an election, yes.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this to me, right, is that it's like a very multi-level structure, but it's also a structure that's like very not about entrenching a single party, right? Like actually for someone to be accepted into like in any round, they had to like pass a supermajority, like 2/3 of the vote, right? And so it's like the way that I think about that is like the goal of this like operator is basically, you know, like you choose, like you basically, yeah, the idea is that people, like the people who are competent at the job of governing, they themselves are the ones that know the other competent people, right? And so effectively you're like asking a bunch of people, you know, who do you know that's the most competent? And you ask the same question to them, you ask the same question to them. And then the theory is eventually, you know, like you find the attractor, right? And like, so this is like actually really friggin' cool, right?
I agree. This is a good way to, in a way, source
yeah, no, it's a great
quality.
right? So, you know, basically, yeah, I mean, like multi-level is good, and like once you stop thinking about
this is multi-level on finding the person, not on every decision needing this multi-level round.
Correct. Yeah.
So this is a one-time action, and then this person is in charge until some review community says you are no longer fit.
Correct. So yes, this was just for electing the Doge. It was not for making individual line items. But the okay, maybe the kind of getting back to the takeaway, right? I think you know, multi-level is good, and like what that also means is that like the design space is much larger than you know, like I think a lot of people have been thinking, and basically you know, like go out and be willing to explore. Maybe, yeah, I mean, final question for you then is, what are some things that, just like from your point of view, if either DAOs for funding allocation or DAOs running things like ENS were to do, like you would consider to be just like genuinely really interesting and you would feel very excited about?
I personally would like to see more initiatives around just pure experimentation that kind of just take on a much more long-term view and explicitly kind of do this with the premise that we're not trying to optimize the token price right now, or it's not a factor. It's about actually improving something long-term, which is, I don't think I've seen R&D departments for DAOs. It's just kind of my personal ask for it. And I think the second piece is just being able to have them experiment and initiate more setups where they are allowed to make faster decisions and take more risks with less capital at kind of to play with, just so that they can help quickly refine what good quality looks like. Because I don't think people will disagree with the fact that we've seen a decent amount of grifting going on with a lot of DAO proposals. And that means you end up discouraging the good players in a lot of cases from trying, but also you don't get to establish a good baseline for what's considered actually exceptional outcome or delivery of great work. And being able to increase the number of outcomes helps you refine and get to the more refined list of, hey, look, even if this is one person, this is what great looks like, and you end up teaching the whole ecosystem, this is how you can set a new norm for what good quality looks like.
Okay, so that sounds like you know, more experimentation and particularly finds more ways to not be not just mediocre but exceptional. So sounds like we have a lot of agreement.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of disagreement.
Amazing. So you know, get out and build.
Yep. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for bearing with us. Please give a massive round of applause for Vitalik.
Thank you.